Many who were drawn to Christ Church Cathedral after hearing you speak recognize that you clearly understand the ways of the world. You connect with the reality of human experience in ways we weren't accustomed to hearing from the pulpit. Listeners sense that you live in the same world that we do. You have the same demands, the same pressures, the same pleasures. How have you been able to keep that balance, man of the cloth, man of the world?
Well, I think that the man of the cloth thing and the man of the world became easier just around that time. We're talking in the 1960s. We came to Vancouver in 1968, and I remember a story. My instinct is, ask me a question and I want to tell you a story. Thomas Merton had to go to the dentist one day, and he borrowed the van and he drove out of the monastery. Remember Gethsemane in Kentucky? And he drove into the nearby city. Forgotten the name of the city, but I always remember that he got out of the van at Walnut and 4th, busy intersection. And there was a lot of people around. And something happened to him that divided his life in two as regards his self-understanding. Up to that point, he'd been monk, monastery, great bell in the evening, gates clanging shut, etc., the world, and the monastery. And he has this marvelous paragraph where he says, I got out of the van, and I locked it, and I looked around me, and I saw all these people, and I realized, in a way I had never realized before in my life, that I was one of them. And that I was living my life as they were trying to live their lives. I was not special. I was not a member of a cult. I was none of those things. I was, and he finishes the paragraph, I was a human being. And I remember reading that around those sort of early years in Vancouver and realizing that in the new kind of world that was forming, and I had a gut feeling that something big was happening, that a world was ending and a world was beginning. And that one was part of that world, and one was not in any way apart from it. So let's get into it. So that was my experience at that time.
A wonderful story. You were ordained in Dublin in 1953. You would be about 25 years old. Presumably you'd been ordained as a deacon before that. How early did you discern a vocation?
Well, you got to think of the fact that the Ireland of the 1940s and 50s was really a different planet than now. Apart from anything else, it's a different planet from the Ireland that's there now. But, for instance, to be a priest, to be ordained, wasn't in any way in those days a countercultural act like it is today. I remember doing a homily a couple of years ago at the ordination of a young woman in Calgary. And the very first sentence I began with, as I said, to accept ordination, to accept being brought into the ordained ministry of the church is, in today's society, essentially a counter-cultural act. In those days, it was the most natural thing in the world. And I realize now, looking back, that because one lived in a sea of Roman Catholicism, 93% majority, And one of the assumptions in the Ireland of those days was that every family would give a son to the church. And while Anglicans didn't kind of do that, in a funny way, it sort of rubbed off. Actually, two of us, my brother and I, we ended up both ordained. Let me tell you about the middle brother, because he makes the story really interesting. Middle brother Terry, he had the intelligence to go into the Revenue Canada eventually. But when he was in the British Air Force in Hong Kong and Singapore, 7 years he was away before he came to Canada, he said, when people would ask him about his family, he said, one brother ordained could happen to anybody, but two took a lot of explaining. So really a sense of vocation was always kind of in the air. I would say went to boarding school for 4 years, really thought seriously of teaching. One time, I think if I'd gone teaching, it would have been history, English, the humanities, was really bad in the sciences. 1920 was either teaching or the church, as we used to call it in those days. And it ended up being the church. And here we are. Half a century, that's being generous, half a century later.
How fortunate for us. Well, you and both your brothers came to Canada. What drew you here?
Well, I got a letter I was about a year ordained, okay? So I get this letter from this chap in Canada whose name is John Anderson, and he's the rector of St. Aidan's in Winnipeg. It's 54, 53. And he says, I don't know if you know this, but a first cousin of your mother's who emigrated to Canada in the 1920s is my church warden. And he's heard in the family that you're ordained, and I need a curate. Would you come? So, I mean, you're 25 and somebody asked you to come to Western Canada, and your mind is full of Chums Annual and Mounties and Rocky Mountains and Canadian Pacific Railways, etc. I mean, why not? But I had to write back and say, I'm really sorry, I can't come because I owe the Church of Ireland for 2 years for a bursary they've given me. And I have to stay 2 years. And life went on, I thought no more about it. Next year, letter. Do you remember these folding letters that you got, airmail things? Came in, opened it, John Anderson says, I'm now the Dean of the Cathedral in Ottawa and I still need a curate. So will you come? And I came. I'll tell you a very amusing thing. My mother had 2 sisters and 2 brothers on the farm in Castlecomer in County Kilkenny. And the 2 older sisters emigrated to Canada in the 20s. And I know one of them, I know why one of them emigrated is because she started going out with one of the British troops that were in the country in 1922, the Black and Tans. And my grandfather said to her, he said, if you are going to continue seeing him, you have to leave because the farm will be burned.
This is Orion's daughter story.
Anyway, so she goes. Then the eldest sister goes, and for some reason that I have never been able to pin down, my mother never liked her eldest sister. Her name was Jean, but Mom always called her, or Ma as we used to call Mom, In the south of Ireland, you called Ma and Da. Jean, Sis, she always called her Sis. But there was something that my mother used to say to me when I was a small boy. She used to say, it was in the days before the psychology of education, okay? And she would say to me, Herbie, if you are bold, you are going to get sent to your Auntie Sis in Canada. So, September 1954. I get off the ship in Montreal. I get into an upper bunk. I didn't know how to get into an upper bunk. I'd never been in a sleeper. I had a gabardine coat, a hat, a briefcase, and an umbrella. I climbed up the damn ladder up to the upper bunk because I didn't know what to do. Anyway, that's another story. So I get the train to Ottawa. I get out of the train. I walk down the platform, and I am embraced to the bosom of my Aunt Jean. So I assumed I must have been a bold boy because I had gone to Canada. Anyway, wonderful boss, John Anderson. The reason he wanted a curate, he wanted 2 curates because he'd accepted being head of the Canadian Legion. And in those days, that was a very, it was, not that long after the war. It was a very sort of honored position, etc. And he had to travel quite a bit across the country. And he was a great guy to work with. I sort of learned from him. He'd been involved in the Battle of Arnhem, chaplain. And the jeep he was in had driven over a mine. And he ended up in Winnipeg in a hospital for 2 years. And he had shrapnel really all down this side, hand, face. There was a little piece of shrapnel near his heart that in those days they couldn't remove. And that was what killed him many years later when it did move. But he said to me one day, Herbert, when you've been 2 years in hospital and you don't know if you're going to come out, everything for the rest of your life is kind of minor stuff. And he communicated that to me. I would get riled up about something, and he would put his hand on my shoulder, incidentally, the damaged hand. I didn't realize that till now. And he would say, Herbert, all will be well. All will be well. Relax. And I treasure the 2.5 years I had with him. I remember one day the Queen came to the cathedral in Ottawa, and John climbed up in the pulpit and realized he'd left his notes in the vestry. And anybody else would have just kind of gone crazy or gone white and fainted or something. And John said, he said something like, Your Majesty, it's been such a pleasure for you to come today that I've left my notes in the vestry, so you will excuse me for a moment. Came down, toddled around, got his notes, came up, did the homily, no sweat.
Was it his example as a chaplain that led you to be a chaplain in the Navy for?
I think partly, although I really wasn't. Okay, in those days you could get an SSA, short service appointment. You went in for 3 years, and then you decided, did I want 25? And they decided, of course. It was mutual. But looking back, I realize now that what was happening in the mid-50s was, it was only a few years after the Korean War. Nobody knew what future wars were going to be like. So I think they were sort of building a reserve, including a reserve of chaplains, and introduced this SSA, this 3-year stint. I remember at the end of 3 years, they gave you $500 for each year. $1,500, which in those days was serious money. I went off and bought the only new car I ever had, a new Volkswagen Beetle. Man, did I feel good. And funny story about that. Went into Hillcrest Motors in Halifax, all set to buy this new Beetle. And we did the deal, and we were in the booth. You know where they put you in the booth and you're about to do the deal. And he said to me, well, Padre, that'll be $1,650. That was the price of a basic Beetle in those days. And I said, gee, I only got $1,500. And his face fell. The whole thing was a bit of theater. And he said, oh, gee, Padre, you know, if it was me, it would be okay, but I don't think my manager will buy it. But I'll ask him. So I said, hang on. So he went off to see the manager. I'm sure he just sort of walked around the shop twice. Came back with an even longer face, and he said, God, Padre, he won't buy it. So I was green as the grass. I never bought a car before, a new car. All I had to do was to say, well, gee, I'm really sorry, and walk for the door, and he would have been on the door before I got there. So I handed over my $1,650, and I learned one of the many lessons I've learned in my life.
Very good.
But we were talking about the Navy. We're talking about the Navy. In those days, the Canadian Navy was responsible with NATO for the Northwest Atlantic. And its chief duty in the Northwest Atlantic was to check Russian fishing boats. Now, there were no more fishing boats than whatever. So we would churn up beyond the coast of Newfoundland and way up around there. And then one of these humongous ships would come out of the mist with about 50 aerials on it, and they would glare at us, and we would glare at them, and then we would sail away again. I guess take their bearings. Someone did a little bit of that, but I wasn't good at it. And so after 3 years, the last year I spent on HMS Shearwater, which is the naval base outside, the air naval base outside Halifax. And there you were kind of responsible for the base congregation. And remember, it's the 50s. Almost everybody and his dog went to church. We had a Sunday school of more than 300 kids, and they were everything. So we had to find about 35 teachers. And you found them where you found them. And we had teachers, I remember we had everything from lapsed Roman Catholics to Jehovah's Witnesses. And I don't know what went on when they closed the door of those classrooms. But anyway, the whole thing worked out. Serious. What I learned in that 3 years was that there was a far bigger world than just Anglicanism, and that world was rapidly changing. So big learning curve, and I'm glad I did it in that sense. Yeah.
Herbie, you've influenced an uncountable number of people. Who have been the big influences apart from John Andrews in your life? Who or what?
You know, what I'm going to say to that sounds kind of frivolous, but it isn't. Maybe not frivolous, kind of eccentric. When somebody says to me, who influenced your life? I think of John Brennan. John Brennan was the hired man on my grandfather's farm. And when I was a little boy, he was very kind to me. He lived about half a mile away, down at the end of a lane, in a tumble-down thatched cottage. The real thing, not the thing that began to be built for tourists years later, because this was only 1935. And he talked to me a lot. And I realized, looking back, that in a childish way, I loved him. I loved John. And one evening, something happened in my life that I never forgot with him. After the cows were milked, there was a large, flat granite stone. Actually, it was about like that table, outside the horse's stable. And he would sit with me, and he would smoke his clay pipe, which again was a genuine clay pipe. It wasn't And he would tell me stories. And he would tell me stories of his travels to Afghanistan, Baluchistan, and the great falls of Niagara. This is what he told me. Now, I don't know whether he'd ever been there, but he didn't have to be for a 7-year-old boy. And I sort of, Baluchistan, Afghanistan, and especially the falls of Niagara. And one evening it happened. It was a long summer evening, August, and because Kilkenny and Dublin area are the same latitude as Edmonton, the summer evenings are endless. And this was a summer evening. It was one of these evenings where the moon was coming out before the sun went down. And the very early stars were beginning to appear. And suddenly John said to me, he said, look up there, boy. He used to call me boy. I looked up, and he said, do you know that they all move? I said, yeah. He said, sun, moon, stars, galaxies, they all move. All the time, they move. And then he paused, because he was a very good storyteller, bless him. And he said, but there was a time that they all stopped moving. And I sort of sat there, open mouth. And he said, you know when they stopped? I said, no. He said, the angel Gabriel came to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and he asked her if she would give birth to the Holy Child. And she was very frightened, and she didn't know what to do. And she didn't say anything. And she didn't say anything for a long time. And while she was silent, the sun and the moon and the stars and the galaxies, they all stopped moving. And when she said yes, they all began to move again. And I'm 88. And what comes down to me across a lifetime is that the Christian faith may be about a small child in a small manger, in a small stable, in a small village, in a small country. It may be small, 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 but it is cosmic, and it is as big as the universe. And that's what John Brennan gave me as a lifelong gift. John was the first person to come to mind.
Yes.
Yeah?
And you're known as a storyteller, probably best known as a storyteller, and you often retell old stories in a new way. You find things in them that other people don't. You turn them in a new direction, almost reworking many of the biblical stories. How do you go about that?
Well, I remember one evening in Washington, in the College of Preachers, and I had done something. I had done a sequence of an incident in Scripture. And I had traced Jesus' journey when he was about 27. And he felt he had to get out of the village. And he had said various no's to people. Should he become a zealot, a radical in the mountains and kill some Romans? And he said no. And somebody comes in from the desert and says, why don't you come into the desert and be a Nazarene and get really turned on? And he said, no, I don't think so. And I think one day, probably somebody from Qumran must have come down the village street and said, why don't you join us? We have a wonderful community. Wash each day, cleansed, do beautiful scrolls. Why don't you come and be an Essene? He says no. And then he hears about his cousin, John, preaching down at the end of the Jordan River. And he says, that's where I want to go. And I had done that sequence. And somebody, when it was over, said to me, how do you do that? And I really was flummoxed. And then I came to realize that all my life, telling a story, I see it as a movie. I see it in images. And there is another reason too, is that in the Ireland I grew up in every child in the country had to do a religious examination once a year. 3 papers, Old Testament, New Testament, and church doctrine. And all other subjects, for a month before that exam, all other subjects would stop. And from 9 to 3, we would do Old Testament, New Testament, church doctrine. Now, for a child, church doctrine was catechism. Okay? Therefore, you developed a kind of encyclopedic acquaintance with the world of the Bible, with its characters, with its locales, and then what finished it off for me was to go there and walk the land. You know, as a Benedictine I met up at the north end of the Lake of Galilee. And he wrote a book that I have, and he called it the Fifth Gospel, because as he said to me, the land is the fifth gospel. And until you read that fifth gospel, it's not real. God, I can remember my very first time in Jerusalem. We stayed in a hostel just on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives. And I was coming back in the evening, myself, and I came out of one of the gates at the southeast end of the city, and I had to go back and I had to go over the Kidron Brook, little bridge, to get to the hostel. Now, if you grew up in Ireland, and if you were a choir boy, and if you were a kid in school, the Kidron Brook means St. John's Gospel, it means Easter, it means Good Friday, it means the upper room, it means all that stuff. So I'm walking across that. What do I see? I see a garbage dump. The brook is dry, the river is dry, and it's used as one of the city garbage dumps. I see a filthy old fridge. I see a set of bald tires. And there's tremendous clash in my mind between, what will I say, totally of this world and totally of my sacred world. And in a split second, my mind goes one of two ways. And it went the way that I have sort of been in ever since. Instead of saying, oh my God, this garbage destroys everything I believe in. But my mind said, not that, my mind said, the one whom I follow came into a world of garbage and was treated like garbage. And it was another of those turning points in my life.